Welcome to the Explainer. It really feels like the ground beneath our traditional systems of governance is just shifting right now. Today, we're exploring a massive core tension in modern political life, the apparent breakdown of the traditional nation-state and the historical and future alternatives that are surfacing as a result. We're going to be drawing on a fascinating analysis by Rana Dasgupta on the demise of the nation-state, alongside a deep dive into the historical political philosophy of anarchism.
Okay, let's dive into this. Here is our roadmap for today. First, we'll look at the crisis of the state. Second, the anarchist alternative. Third, living without rulers. And finally, a post-national future.
Part 1. The Crisis of the State. We often treat the chaotic events of contemporary global politics like they're just isolated national problems. But the analysis we're looking at today suggests something much deeper, that all countries are actually embedded in the exact same failing system, facing an unprecedented crisis of authority. Just think about this staggering number for a second, $250 billion. At the time our source was published, that represented Apple's offshore cash reserves. To put that into perspective, that single corporate reserve was literally greater than the combined foreign reserves of the British government and the Bank of England. It's wild, right? But it perfectly illustrates how the nation-state has lost its grip on deregulated global finance. For a lot of the 20th century, governments had real mastery over their national economies, which let them fund massive public projects. But today, wealth just routinely escapes national jurisdictions entirely. It moves into this booming offshore zone, leaving states completely unable to fulfill those old moral promises of development and security.
And from the flight of capital, we have to pivot to the flight of human beings. 65 million. That is a massive number of global refugees, and it really demonstrates the profound human cost of a failing system. The sources point out that this is basically a new normal that far exceeds even the 40 million refugees displaced during the massive global emergency back in 1945. What's deeply concerning is that since 1989, barely 5% of wars have actually taken place between states. Instead, we are seeing the internal collapse of nations into these fractured, warring quasi-states. Just look at places like Libya, which tragically fractured into rival governments and militia groups fighting over resources.
The writer Rana Dasgupta actually summarizes this modern paradox perfectly. He writes, 20th century political structures are drowning in a 21st century ocean of deregulated finance, autonomous technology, religious militancy, and great power rivalry. The core premise here is simply that the antiquated boundaries of the nation-state are being totally overwhelmed by globalized forces that operate entirely outside of their control.
The text frames all of these distinct issues strictly as symptoms of a much larger systemic decline. We have the loss of economic control to offshore wealth. We have corporate technology bypassing borders. Just think about how we navigate our daily lives. We rely on corporate tech companies for functions that used to be strictly reserved for the state. Things like mapping our streets or acting as the absolute gatekeepers of our social reality. We're also seeing the collapse of post-colonial quasi-states that were hastily drawn together and propped up during the Cold War. And finally, the rise of transnational militant networks that just ignore borders entirely, literally building their own networks of tax collection and trade routes. So these aren't just isolated crises, they are very real symptoms of an advanced state of political decay.
Which brings us to Part 2, the anarchist alternative.
So, while the state is obviously struggling today, people have actually been dreaming of a stateless world for centuries. Now, the term anarchism is heavily misunderstood. It's almost always equated with total chaos. But if we break down the etymology, it instantly clarifies what the term really means. It comes from the ancient Greek word anarchia, which translates to without a ruler. It's a political philosophy and a movement that seeks to abolish any institutions that perpetuate authority, coercion, or hierarchy, so primarily targeting the state and capitalism. The absolutely crucial takeaway here is that anarchism advocates for living without rulers, not without order. It basically argues for replacing the state with voluntary free associations and stateless societies.
And if we trace the evolution of anarchism, it really emerged out of the Enlightenment in the 18th century, challenging both secular and religious intellectual authority, before eventually flourishing into this massive movement for workers' emancipation. And it wasn't just abstract theory either. Anarchists played pivotal roles in major historical events. We're talking about working-class radicals taking over the Paris Commune back in 1871, or folks collectivizing rural lands during the Spanish Civil War in 1936. Fast forward a bit to 1999, and we saw a huge resurgence of anarchism in the anti-globalization movement, famously organizing those massive protests against the World Trade Organization in Seattle.
And this brilliantly illustrates the umbrella nature of the whole movement. It's not just one single dogma, it's more like a constellation of different schools of thought. On one side of the spectrum, you have social anarchism, things like anarcho-communism and collectivism. That side emphasizes positive liberty, focusing really heavily on community distribution, equality, and social ownership. Then, on the flip side, you have individualist anarchism, which emphasizes negative liberty, focusing purely on opposing external restraints on the free individual. So, while they definitely disagree on economics and organization, they're united by the shared core principles of autonomy, mutual aid, and decentralization.
Moving on to Part 3, Living Without Rulers.
So, you might be wondering, how is this abstract philosophy pragmatically applied? Like, if you take away the state, how does a society actually function? Well, let's take education as an example. The sources contrast state and anarchist educational models, and it's pretty eye-opening. State education is generally viewed as a service run by a central authority, right? It's heavily focused on vocational training to produce productive members of an existing capitalist society. Anarchist education, conversely, views learning as self-mastery. It's totally community-based and practice-based, focusing on the child's autonomy rather than top-down indoctrination. Historically, anarchists actually set up these things called modern schools to foster critical thinking and class consciousness, really seeking to prove that complex social services can be conceptualized entirely outside of state control.
Now, while historical anarchism sometimes carries a stigma of violence, the text explains that many contemporary anarchists focus heavily on evolutionary tactics. This means they are actively building alternative social organizations right now, today, based on mutual interdependence. They use direct action and mutual aid. Think of groups like Food Not Bombs. They build counter-institutions like self-managed social centers, and they utilize consensus decision-making. This is an anti-authoritarian approach known as horizontalism, where everyone literally has an equal say. It's a strategy of prefigurative politics. Basically, they're embodying the exact stateless voluntary society they hope to bring about right in the present moment.
Finally, Part 4, A Post-National Future.
Let's bring this explainer into its final synthesis, merging that modern critique of the failing state we started with this historical drive for a world organized beyond national borders. After World War I, U.S. President Woodrow Wilson envisioned a world organized into nation-states bound by a society of nations and international infrastructure governed by law. While the source argues that this vision has utterly failed, the Cold War and great power rivalries essentially destroyed those constraints, effectively turning the nation-state system into what they describe as a lawless gangland. Because the current system has failed to deliver security or dignity to vast portions of the globe, populations are increasingly being forced into post-national solidarities. They are demanding a completely new political infrastructure that can actually operate on the scale of our massive globalized problems.
So the crucial point is this. How do we actually fix a globally interconnected world that is completely stuck in local, national politics? Well, Dasgupta outlines 3 pragmatic solutions. First, tracking the money. We absolutely need to implement global financial regulation to monitor transnational money flows and pull that offshore wealth back into public channels. Second, upgrading democracy. Establishing a global, flexible democracy means creating transnational political mechanisms so when national politics break down, citizens actually have higher tiers of democratic authority to appeal to. And third, and this is perhaps the most radical one, rethinking citizenship entirely. Currently, 97% of citizenship is inherited, making it a system of massive accidental inequality. The argument here is that if capital has the freedom to move globally, then human rights and mobility must be decoupled from rigid borders as well.
The forces of finance, technology, and global crisis have quite literally outgrown the lines drawn on our maps. The anarchists have argued for centuries that centralized states are an unnecessary hierarchy, and modern political critics are warning us right now that the state is losing its grip entirely. If the nation-state as we know it is truly becoming obsolete, are we ready to build a new system? Are we ready to become citizens of the world? It's a massive challenge for our political imagination, for sure, but it's one the modern world might soon demand we answer. Thanks so much for joining this explainer.